Welcome to Historic Lullabies. I'm so glad you're here, whether it's your first time listening or your 100th. I hope this quiet journey finds you in a peaceful moment, wherever you are in the world tonight. So, settle in, let your pillow soften beneath your head, let your breath slow, just a little. There's nothing urgent waiting for you now, just the steady rhythm of a story meant to soothe and maybe even surprise you, gently. Tonight's question may take you somewhere unexpected. You've likely heard the word samurai before. It might bring to mind images of gleaming swords, silent duels under cherry trees, or fierce warriors loyal to their lords. But what if I told you? The truth of their lives was far quieter, far softer, and in many ways, more beautiful. This story is about why samurai spent more time writing poetry than drawing their swords. It's about honor, yes, but also about ink, about silence, about the long hours of waiting that shaped a culture of discipline and thoughtfulness. And it's about how power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Now. I do hope this story helps you relax, maybe even drift off to sleep. But I should gently warn you, this one might be too oddly lovely, too strangely calming to ignore entirely. If you stay awake, well, you'll walk away with a pocket full of curious truths, and perhaps a newfound respect for the poets in armor. Before we float too far into tonight's story, a gentle like or subscribe would mean a lot, and helps Historic Lullabies keep growing quietly, one dreamy listener at a time. And if you feel like sharing, I'd love to know where you're listening from, and what time it is in your part of the world. Midnight, early morning, a rainy afternoon. Now, close your eyes. If they're not already closed, take a breath in and let it out slowly. Just one, and as the night wraps around you, we'll begin. Long ago, in a Japan not yet unified, the warrior class was rising. But to understand the samurai, you must begin not with a sword, but with a brush. It's easy to imagine the samurai as always in battle. After all, that's how they're shown in movies. Swift, stoic, always striking. But truth is softer, quieter. Most samurai lived in long stretches of peace, broken by brief, terrible conflict. And in those quiet years, their duty didn't vanish. It changed. The sword stayed at their side, always. But the real work, the daily work, was not war. It was study, reflection, 1,000 small moments of inner battle against impatience, pride, fear, and ego, against the rusting of their own spirits. And so, they turned to poetry, not as decoration, not as a hobby, but as training, for the mind, for the soul. To write a poem was to sharpen yourself. To write one well was to master silence, emotion, and structure. It was to hold a thought so gently that it bloomed without breaking. Samurai poetry took many forms. Most often, it was the waka, a 5-line verse with a flowing rhythm. Later, the haiku, with its tight 17 syllables and breath-like simplicity. These were not elaborate epics or grand stories. No, samurai wrote of mist, of falling leaves, of the space between footsteps, of what could not be spoken, only felt. You imagine one now, sitting by a paper window. The light is dim, filtering through rice paper panels. Outside, a breeze stirs the edge of a bamboo grove. He holds a brush, not a blade, and dips it into ink. Perhaps he writes, "Autumn moonlight." A worm digs silently into the chestnut. That's Basho, not just a poet, but a former samurai. His life turned from the sword to the scroll, and his words echoed longer than his battles ever did. And here's where it becomes more than just art. Poetry wasn't optional. It was taught in formal training. Young samurai, especially those of noble houses, were expected to compose verse alongside martial drills, sword in the morning, ink in the evening. One discipline tempered the other. There's a quiet genius in this, for when you teach a warrior to observe a drifting leaf, to notice the silence after rain, to hold stillness without boredom, you shape someone who does not crave violence, who can live in the long pauses of peace without growing reckless. Historians still argue whether this emphasis on poetry made the samurai more gentle, or simply more introspective, but there's little debate that it made them complex and deeply human. Some even found poetry in their final moments. A tradition emerged, the jizei, or death poem. Warriors would compose a last verse before a fatal battle, or before ritual suicide, not to dramatize, but to clarify, as if, at the edge of life, the right 17 syllables could bring the world into perfect focus. One wrote, "Had I not known that I was dead already, I would have mourned my loss of life." And in those lines, you feel the calm resolve of someone who had spent years preparing not just to fight, but to reflect. These warriors carried steel, yes, but they also carried silence and softness and a deep respect for fleeting things, for a world that could vanish in the time it took to exhale, and so they wrote it down. You begin to see now, don't you, how the samurai were not just guardians of land or lords, but guardians of feeling, of restraint, of the pause between actions, and how in that pause they found poetry. Let's stay with that thought. As we drift onward, the ink on the page dries slowly, a whisper of black curling gently into the grain of the rice paper. Outside, a distant crow calls once, then falls quiet again. You can almost hear the soft rasp of cloth as a samurai adjusts his sitting position, brushing dust from his sleeve before returning to his poem. He does not reach for his sword, not yet. He has not needed it in weeks, maybe months. But the brush is used every day. In this moment, you begin to realize something subtle. The samurai's life is not filled with violence. It is filled with waiting. And in the waiting, he writes. The idea of a warrior with a pen might seem odd, even contradictory. But in the world of feudal Japan, contradiction was a kind of art form. The samurai were taught to embody paradoxes, stillness and action, ruthlessness and beauty, strength and grace. To hold those tensions, not to resolve them, but to live inside them, was the true discipline. You imagine one such warrior now, seated beneath the low wooden beams of his home. His armor is neatly stored in a lacquered box, but his inkstone is out. The poem he's composing is simple, but careful. Chrysanthemums bloom. A child's footsteps on the path stir fallen petals. It's not about glory, not about conquest, just a quiet moment, captured. And that's the essence of the practice. To write poetry wasn't about entertainment. It was a way to hone perception, to notice, to name, to reduce the vastness of life into something graspable, and in doing so, to learn control. That same control would later shape how a sword was drawn, or how a command was spoken. You're beginning to see it now, how discipline bleeds across boundaries. The brush and the blade train the same muscle, and neither works well without the other. This connection between art and combat goes back centuries. Even in early Japanese texts like The Tale of the Heike, warriors are praised not just for their bravery, but for their elegance, their composure under fire, their ability to write a verse even while surrounded by chaos. This was not seen as weakness, quite the opposite. The man who could remain poetic in war was thought to possess true mastery over himself. One famous story tells of a samurai who, while fleeing from enemies, paused atop a ridge to write a poem about the view. He was captured moments later, but his captors, reading the verse, were so moved by its beauty that they spared his life. Perhaps apocryphal, But it tells you something real. Not every samurai was so eloquent. Of course, many were not literate at all. But among the educated class, especially during the Edo period, poetry became a required skill. Lords expected it, teachers demanded it, peers admired it, and within each household, it was cultivated like a garden. Even the shoguns, military rulers at the very top of the hierarchy, practiced poetry. Tokugawa Ieyasu, for example, left behind not just laws and battle strategies, but dozens of poems reflecting on nature, fate, and the weight of power. You can imagine him too, a man who united a fractured country, sitting beneath lantern light, composing a verse about the stillness of snowfall. This was not a hobby, it was a mark of completeness. Because to be a samurai was not simply to fight well, it was to carry yourself with precision, with grace. To write clearly was to think clearly, and clear thought, more than raw muscle, was what separated the skilled from the reckless. So they learned to pause, to let the ink settle before finishing a line, to observe the changing shape of a cloud before lifting a brush, to wait. In that waiting, many found something unexpected, peace. Even as wars simmered in the background, even as loyalties shifted and old families fell, the samurai returned to their verses like one might return to breath. It anchored them, reminded them that while the world might rage, the self could remain still. There's something soothing in this, isn't there? A warrior, seated in silence, thinking about plum blossoms, a world of violence softened by words, a code of action tempered by reflection. And even now, the words remain, surviving not just in museums or dusty archives, but in how people still think about discipline, balance, the quiet power of restraint. You might not live with a sword at your side, but you understand the value of pausing, of writing something small, of noticing. The samurai did too, and so they carried their brushes into the study, into the garden, sometimes even into battle. Ink and blood lived close together, but it was the ink that lasted. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it still. The scratch of a bamboo pen, the rustle of fabric as a scroll is unrolled, the hush that comes when someone chooses words instead of violence. This was the world of the samurai, not loud, not constant, but deliberate. Each stroke, like each movement of the sword, was measured, controlled, poised, and in that measured life, there was room for more than war. There was room for the seasons, for wind, for longing, for beauty. You're starting to feel it now, aren't you? That strange softness behind the armor, that quiet that lives beneath all the noise. Let's stay here just a little longer. The tatami mat beneath you gives slightly, a whisper beneath folded knees. Somewhere nearby, a candle flickers, its tiny flame leaning toward a draft, only it seems to feel. A breeze stirs through the open shoji screen, brushing against your arm like an old friend. You feel the hush of discipline in the room, an atmosphere shaped not by fear, but by form. This is the world of Bushido, the way of the warrior. But as you rest here, beside the bow and the brush, you begin to understand that Bushido was never just about the battlefield. It was a way of being, for the samurai. Every action carried weight. How one stood, how one bowed, how one spoke or didn't. The sword was merely the final extension of a life lived in awareness. And like the sword, the brush revealed what could not be hidden. Your mood, your focus, your honesty. A single wavering stroke could betray hesitation. A perfect character told of a still mind. So, the training was never only martial. Yes, the bow was practiced. The sword was drawn, sheathed, drawn again. But just as often, the samurai practiced stillness, calligraphy, composition, etiquette, restraint, because true mastery, they believed, was never loud. You picture a young apprentice now, barely into his teens. His armor is too big. His voice cracks when he speaks. But each morning, before he touches his training sword, he must kneel before an inkstone. His task? To copy one line from an ancient poem. Not because the poem itself is magic, but because the act of copying requires presence. The line reads, "Though the wind blows hard, the bamboo does not break. It learns to bend." And so, he writes. You can imagine the care it takes. The brush must be held just so. Not too tight, not too loose. The ink must flow, but not drip. The posture must be straight, the mind calm. Each stroke is deliberate, practiced, and yet fleeting. Like breath. These early lessons stay with him. They become part of his hand, his shoulder, his silence. 8 years later, on the eve of a campaign, he may write a haiku before battle, not because he is soft, but because he has learned that fear, like ink, can be shaped into something graceful if you move with care. This is the paradox of the samurai path. To become a warrior, one must first become still. In fact, Bushido itself evolved not in times of constant war, but in times of relative peace. During the Edo period, when battles were rare and samurai had less need to fight, their code deepened inward. What had once been tactics and bloodshed became philosophy and balance. They studied Zen, they gardened, they wrote, they perfected the art of living in tension. Sheathed sword, unspoken thought, quiet power. And this was not seen as strange, it was admired. The warrior who acted with restraint was the warrior to be trusted. The one who struck only after pausing, reflecting, breathing. The one who could sit alone for hours and be no less strong. Historians still argue whether this inward turn weakened the samurai or refined them. But the stories they left behind point to something lasting. There's a dignity in their quiet, not silence born of repression, but of awareness. One account tells of a samurai who, when challenged to a duel, accepted calmly. He rose early the next morning, drank tea, and wrote a short poem. He dressed slowly, walked to the appointed place, and bowed deeply to his opponent. Then, rather than fight, he offered the poem and asked if that might resolve the quarrel. The other samurai read the verse, bowed in return, and walked away. There are no records of the poem itself, only that two warriors left unscathed, and a conflict ended in ink rather than blood. Perhaps that story is embellished, but the values it reflects are real, and you can feel it now. The rhythm of this life, not a frantic race, but a steady pacing. A world where precision is power, where a single word can carry more than a shout. Even the bow, the traditional long-range weapon of the samurai, required poetry. Not literally, but in practice. Drawing a bow was an act of ceremony. The breathing, the posture, the silent focus before the release. It wasn't unlike composing a haiku, brief, precise, and final. You imagine the moment before the arrow flies, a pause, the exhale, the complete commitment to motion, and in that motion, a kind of release, just as the brush touches paper. So, in their training, both weapons and words were given weight, neither more noble, neither less vital. A samurai who mastered one but neglected the other was seen as incomplete. This expectation extended into court life as well. When samurai served as advisors or officials, their poetry was not merely tolerated, it was expected. A skilled verse could curry favor. A poorly written one might cause embarrassment. And during times of peace, poems served as gifts, as tests of character, even as tools of diplomacy. Poetry, like the sword, became a way to navigate power, But unlike the sword, it left no wounds. You begin to understand why they held the brush so closely. Because a blade might protect your body, but words protected your honor, your memory, your inner life. They were the one weapon you could wield against time itself. And so, generation after generation, samurai passed down not only swords, but scrolls, not only tactics, but texts, not only muscle, but meaning. In this passing down, something beautiful bloomed, a tradition of strength softened by sensitivity, of courage shaped by compassion, of poetry written not despite being a warrior, but because of it. You can feel that blooming now, even across centuries, like the cherry blossoms that fall without sound, each one a perfect moment, gone too soon, yet never forgotten. So, you rest here, gently, between bough and brush, breathing with the rhythm of lives long past. Let's continue quietly as their story unfolds. The candle that flickered earlier has burned lower now. The pool of wax at its base cools into soft ridges like miniature mountain ranges, unmoving and pale. Outside, the breeze that once stirred the paper screens has drifted off to sleep. All is still. And in this stillness, you begin to feel what the samurai knew so well. Waiting is not idleness. It is training. The life of a samurai was defined not by constant action, but by the space between. Weeks, sometimes years, could pass without the clang of armor or the urgency of war. And in those long, quiet stretches, the warrior trained, but not just the body, the mind, the breath, the will. You can picture it. A samurai seated in the garden just before sunrise. His sword rests nearby, untouched. He does not move. He does not speak. He watches a single drop of dew make its slow descent down a bamboo stalk. This is not boredom. This is discipline. This is the invisible practice of patience. To be ready, he must know how to wait. And not just wait, but wait without decay, without softening. The samurai's strength was not measured only by muscle or skill, but by how long he could sit in silence without unraveling. And in that silence, poetry bloomed. Writing became not just an outlet, but a tool. To write was to stay sharp, to keep the mind alert and the senses awake. Each poem, each line of calligraphy was like a mental sparring session, quiet but exacting. One teacher from the Edo period reportedly told his students, "If you cannot sit still long enough to finish a poem, how will you hold your stance in battle?" The lesson wasn't just metaphor, it was method. And so the warrior trained on the mat, in the garden, with the brush, with the bow, not for glory, not for conquest, but to be ready for whatever came next. Ready without rushing. This readiness extended even to their clothing. Robes were folded just so. Swords were placed with care. Meals were taken with exact timing. Even laughter was measured, never too loud. Not because joy was forbidden, but because control was the highest form of strength. You see it again and again, restraint is power. A story is told of a young samurai, challenged to a duel in the street by a drunk and angry rival. The young man did not draw his sword. He bowed, he apologized, quietly, and he walked away. Later, when asked why he refused to fight, he answered simply, "My teacher once said, 'Let your silence be sharper than your blade.' I wish to honor that." This kind of discipline is hard to grasp in a world where speed is prized. But the samurai believed the moment you hurry, you lose your edge. Precision, after all, is born of slowness. It's why their poetry was so deliberate. A haiku might take hours to write, not because the words were hard to find, but because the meaning was already inside. They just had to uncover it, one breath at a time. Like this, snow on the lantern. A crow lands, then lifts again. All returns to still. You can almost hear the scene, the hush of snow, the soft thud of feathered feet, the brief disturbance, and then the silence again, untouched. This is the rhythm they live by, not bursts, but cycles, not frenzy, but flow. And in that rhythm, they found something most warriors never seek: awareness. Awareness of the world, of beauty, of endings. Because the samurai knew, perhaps better than anyone, that life could vanish in an instant. A duel, a command, a shift in power. So they trained to notice the small things, to feel time as it moved, to be grateful not just for the victories, but for the chance to breathe. This didn't make them soft. It made them steady. And steadiness, in the end, was more terrifying to an enemy than rage. A man who shouts may be brave, but a man who smiles gently while drawing his sword, he is someone who has already weighed every possible outcome. He has written the ending in verse and accepted it. Historians still argue whether this intense inner discipline made the samurai rigid or wise. Some say it limited them. Others claim it freed them from impulse, from fear, from the noise of ego. What is clear, though, is that this way of waiting shaped their legacy just as much as any battle ever did. You begin to feel the strength in it yourself, in the stillness of your breath, in the way your hands relax without being told, in how the quiet is no longer empty, but full. This is the pause between movements, the moment before the ink touches paper, the final exhale before a blade is drawn. And here, in this space, the samurai lived most fully. They trained for combat, yes, but more often, they trained for silence, for patience, for watching cherry blossoms fall without clinging, for listening to wind as if it held instructions, for finding poetry in a crack on the floor. This training shaped not just their actions, but their reputations. A samurai who moved too fast, who acted rashly, could bring shame on his house. But one who moved with intention, even if that meant not acting at all, was remembered with respect. Some left behind more poems than wounds. And you wonder, could that be the point? That maybe the greatest victory wasn't surviving a duel, but writing the verse that made the duel unnecessary. You lie there now, still and soft, carried by that thought, that a warrior might sit as you are now, eyes closed, breath slow, and grow stronger with every quiet second. Let's remain in that stillness a little longer. A faint scent of pine lingers in the folds of the paper. The ink, still damp, glistens under the flicker of lantern light, though the room remains almost completely still. You rest your hand on the tatami mat, tracing the woven fibers with your fingertips. Time doesn't feel linear here. It stretches, folds, and pauses, just like the life of the samurai. You begin to realize something now, something that floats up quietly, like the surface of a still pond rippling under a single falling leaf. The sword, though ever present, was not the first instinct. Ink often came before blood. For all their preparation, most samurai would go through long stretches without ever engaging in combat. This wasn't a failure of duty. It was simply the world they lived in, one of formality, politics, alliances, and peace maintained through power more than action. And in those seasons of no war, the mind had to stay sharp. The soul had to stay disciplined. And so, they turned inward, to poetry, to scrolls, to brushwork. The pen was not mightier than the sword. It was the practice that made the sword unnecessary. You picture a young retainer kneeling by a low table, his sleeves carefully tied back, the brush steady in his hand. He's composing a verse, not for love, nor glory, but as a daily ritual, a way to remember who he is when nothing demands he fight. The poem reads, "The bell rings once, a moth turns its wing to silence. No enemy near, it's quiet, humble, yet it holds power. Because in a world where one's reputation preceded the blade, a well-placed poem could command respect, even fear. Many samurai learned to use their words to establish presence, to navigate the layered expectations of feudal society. A subtle insult buried in metaphor, a firm refusal expressed through nature imagery. These were not mere flourishes. They were strategic tools, and often they worked better than weapons. There's a record of a high-ranking official in the Tokugawa shogunate who received a veiled threat through a rival's envoy. Instead of returning fire, literally or figuratively, he responded with a haiku. Beneath fresh snowfall, the pine does not speak of storms. Its roots do the talking. No duel followed. The message was clear. This art of response, measured, poetic, precise, became a skill just as critical as swordplay. To answer quickly with violence was seen as crude, but to reply with metaphor, with composed grace, that was elegance. That was power held in reserve. And you start to see how poetry was not just self-expression. It was a kind of diplomacy, a duel with syllables, a demonstration of discipline so profound that it disarmed tension rather than escalated it. Historians still debate how widespread this truly was. Some argue that the literary refinement of the samurai class has been romanticized, shaped by the quieter peace of the Edo era. But even if a few stories were embellished, their existence reveals a truth. The ideal samurai, the complete samurai, was expected to be as fluent in silence and verse as he was in combat. This expectation gave rise to entire schools of writing within samurai education. Students would study classical Chinese poetry alongside military tactics. A morning might begin with sword drills and end with calligraphy exercises. The transitions between these worlds were seamless, no separation between steel and script. You imagine an old master watching his pupils. One strikes too quickly in sparring, his movements rushed and uncertain. Later, that same student writes a poem without pause, careless in his choice of words. The master corrects neither directly. He simply reads aloud, "The wind does not rush through the plum tree before spring. Why should you?" And with that, the lesson is learned. Poetry became a mirror. It reflected the habits of the soul, the quality of attention, the depth of character. To write with care was to live with care. And this translated back into the warrior's path. How you handled your brush often revealed how you would handle your blade. There's something beautifully symmetrical in that. The ink that stains your fingers in the morning is the same ink that tempers your hand at dusk. Some samurai carried notebooks with them, not to document strategy or numbers, but to jot down passing thoughts, natural imagery, questions that would never be spoken aloud. One popular exercise involved composing poems to unseen seasons, writing about spring and winter, or about snow while sitting under the hot summer sun. It was a way of remembering that the present is always part of something larger, just like war is part of peace, and silence part of power. One samurai, writing late in life, captured this balance in a poem said to be tucked into his sleeve the day he died. The ink has dried now, and the blade rests by the door. Evening comes again. You linger on that image. A man ready, but not tense. Watchful, but not afraid. His strength is not in how quickly he can react, but in how long he can remain still without losing himself. That's the kind of strength the samurai valued. Not the shout, but the breath before it. Not the attack, but the decision not to. Not the blade raised in anger, but the hand that chooses the brush instead. And maybe you think, this is a kind of poetry too. The poetry of restraint, of choosing to express rather than explode, of writing not to show off, but to understand. You feel your own breathing slow with this realization. There's no rush, no deadline, just the soft unfolding of thought and presence, word after word, like footsteps in fresh snow. The ink may come before the blood, but its echo lasts far longer, so you settle further into stillness, your thoughts quieting, your body calm. The scroll has more to reveal. The brush lifts gently from the page. A single stroke finishes a line, and for a moment, everything feels complete. You let that pause linger, the kind of pause that lives in the quiet after writing, when the ink still shines slightly wet, and the heart still echoes with the final words. But outside, distant thunder hums? Or is it the low, dull tremble of marching feet? A new sound enters this story, not loud, not sudden, but steady. The sound of war, of duty called. Even in these moments, the samurai did not set the brush aside. You picture a tent, pitched hastily on damp earth. Its fabric rustles as wind sweeps across a darkened plain. Inside, a warrior sits cross-legged by lamplight, his sword within reach, his armor waiting beside him like a second skin. And yet, what he holds is neither weapon nor map. It's a small sheet of paper. He writes, not orders, not strategies. A letter, a poem, a record of thought carved softly into the chaos. The fireflies drift low. A horse nickers by the stream. Still, I miss your voice. These battlefield letters were more than messages. They were lifelines, anchors, proof that a man could still feel tenderly, even while surrounded by the unrelenting discipline of war. Some of these letters were sent home, to wives, to children, to aging parents waiting far away. Others were tucked into sleeves or armor plates, never meant to be delivered, small confessions carried into battle, kept close to the heart. The samurai believed that even on the edge of death, beauty could be made, that a final thought, if shaped with care, could outlast the sword. There's a record of a commander who instructed his men to write something, anything, the night before a major siege, not for morale, not for record, just to remember who they were before the dawn changed everything. What was written varied. Some wrote prayers, some confessed regrets, others described the color of the sky. One wrote simply, "Tomorrow I may fall, but tonight the soup was warm." That line, rescued from the belongings of the fallen, still exists in a preserved scroll, a reminder that, sometimes, the most enduring legacy is a single honest moment. Historians still argue whether these battlefield poems were widespread or practiced only among the elite. But there's little doubt that the act itself held power. Whether public or private, writing before battle gave shape to the shapeless, to fear, to love, to transience. In fact, some warriors believed that composing a verse before combat helped them enter the right state of mind, not one of frenzy, but of clarity. Because clarity, they knew, could save a life. And the act of writing forced stillness, the kind of stillness that separated a reckless charge from a thoughtful choice. You imagine the contrast. Outside, warriors sharpening blades, shouting drills into the dark. Inside, another samurai pauses, brushes a lock of hair from his brow, and finishes a final line. "If I do not return, let the plum tree still bloom bright." That will be enough. It's hard not to feel the weight of it, the grace. Even in moments of fear, the samurai sought elegance. They believed that a clean line, written with care, could reflect a clean death, one accepted, not resisted. And while modern minds might recoil at such fatalism, for the samurai, it was clarity. Writing gave them control over what little they could still shape, a last act of will, a final frame for the unknowable. Even in the heat of battle, there are records of warriors pausing to write. Not always wisely, perhaps, but instinctively. One tells of a young fighter who, upon seeing his childhood friend fall beside him, dropped to his knees and composed a single verse on a scrap of cloth torn from his sash. He tied it to the hilt of his friend's sword before moving on. The poem read, "You walked beside me. Now the wind walks in your place. I will keep pace still." No one retrieved that cloth. It was found decades later, sealed in the family shrine, a faded thread holding memory to steel. You begin to see how these poems stitch something together. They wove emotion into action. They tethered identity to moments that might otherwise dissolve. It's tempting to see poetry and battle as opposites, but here they sit side by side, as they did in the lives of those who practiced both. A sword can cut, a poem can bind. Both can shape the world. And so, the samurai wrote before, during, after, with hands that trembled, with hands that steadied, with hands stained by ink and earth alike. They wrote because they knew the sword could end a story. But the poem could carry it forward. Even today, some of these battlefield writings survive, preserved not in dusty vaults, but in folded families, passed down through generations as soft-spoken heirlooms, whispered over meals, pressed between pages. A grandfather might read them to a grandchild and say, "This was your ancestor's voice, on the night he didn't know if there would be a morning." And the child, wide-eyed, would listen. Not because the words were dramatic, but because they were simple, and because they were real. Now, as your breathing slows again, you let those simple truths settle, ink before blood, words in the shadow of war, stillness in the heart of motion. And you wonder, perhaps not all battles were meant to be won with force. Some, maybe, were meant to be written through. You sit very still now, as if the echoes of those battlefield letters have softened the air around you. Everything feels hushed, not in mourning, but in reverence, as if the story itself has lowered its voice. And just like the samurai, you follow the quiet. In this silence, another image emerges, not one of armor or arrows, but of steam rising from a shallow ceramic bowl. A hand, steady and graceful, lifts it with care. 2 fingers support the rim, a thumb beneath. No sloshing, no haste, just warmth, balance, and breath. You are in a tea room now, not the kind for casual sipping, but a ceremonial one, low-ceilinged, sparsely decorated, and deliberately simple. Nothing here is loud, including the emotions. This is Channoyu, the way of tea, and it is here, perhaps more than anywhere else, that the samurai's love of poetry, discipline, and death quietly converged. Yes, death. Because the tea ceremony wasn't just a social ritual. It was a meditative act of presence, often performed by samurai before a duel, or before taking their own life. It was a way to meet mortality with clarity, to be fully alive in the minutes before letting go. You see it clearly now. A samurai kneels on the tatami. He is not trembling. He is not speaking. He turns the bowl 3 times, slowly, reverently, and takes a single sip. This might be the last warmth he feels. Still, his movements are graceful. His face is calm. The tea ceremony, at its heart, is about control, not over others, but over the self. Every detail is deliberate. How the water is heated, how the whisk is turned, how the cup is handled. There is a poem in each gesture, a discipline in every breath, a quiet decision to act with care, even in the shadow of an ending. And this, too, was part of the samurai's training. They didn't learn the tea ceremony simply to entertain or impress. They learned it to rehearse surrender, not defeat, but surrender to the present, to uncertainty, to beauty that disappears the moment it's held. One of the central values of the tea tradition is wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness, a chipped bowl, a fading blossom, a moment that will never happen again. The samurai understood this deeply because their lives were full of such moments, and their poems often echoed it. The tea grows bitter, but the bowl, still warm with light, does not seem to mind. There's something deeply human in that, isn't there? To know that time is slipping, yet still pour the water gently. To know that pain is near, yet still admire the shape of steam. To find serenity not in what lasts, but in what is leaving. Historians still argue how widespread the tea ceremony truly was among samurai ranks. Some say it was a luxury for the elite. Others insist it filtered down over time, like ink bleeding through paper. What is known as this? Those who practiced it took it seriously. For them, the ceremony was not a break from their code. It was an expression of it. A sword could end life, but tea honored it. You imagine a duel now, the kind that would be remembered for years. Two warriors, both poets, both trained in tea. Before they meet at dawn, each prepares his cup, each bows to an empty room, each writes a verse, not to the opponent, not to the world, just to the moment. One writes, today, perhaps snow, perhaps steel, but first, hot tea and a cloudless mind. That, in itself, is a kind of victory. To walk toward danger with a steady hand, to choose grace instead of panic, to sip something warm when everything else turns cold. The tea room became a kind of mirror for the samurai's soul, small, clean, uncluttered, with no place to hide, every movement visible, every hesitation amplified. You could not fake calm. You could not pretend focus. The ceremony revealed who you were, and so, over time, tea became something more than ritual. It became reflection. There are stories of warriors returning from campaigns and going straight to the tea house, not to celebrate, but to realign, to sit still, to wash the blood from the mind, not just the hands, to remember how to hold something gently. Even the tools, simple, worn, were treated with reverence. The bamboo whisk, the iron kettle, the clay bowl passed down through generations. Not for status, but for spirit. Each item had a story, and each story had its own quiet dignity. One master wrote, "If your hand trembles, do not correct the motion, just pour more slowly. That, too, is discipline, not perfection, but presence, the ability to notice without judgment, to move with the rhythm of things rather than against them." And this is what the samurai trained for, not just in tea, but in life. They did not chase immortality. They practiced impermanence. They embraced the beauty of fading ink, falling leaves, cooling bowls. Their poems were not declarations, but observations. Gentle nods to the way things change. Like this one, steam curls, then vanishes. The guest leaves, the cup is still, but the warmth remains. That warmth, it lingers, doesn't it? Even now, as you rest in your own quiet space, far from any battlefield, you can feel it. The way a soft moment can shape you more than a loud one. The way discipline can look like gentleness. The way a warrior's strength can live not in his swing, but in his stillness. So you remain here, beside the tea, the bowl empty, the mind calm. The next moment waits, but there is no hurry. And perhaps, like the samurai, you are learning that the most powerful thing you can do is to be fully here. Let's stay in this stillness just a little longer. The tea bowl rests, empty and serene, its faint heat sinking into the mat below. Your breath matches the quiet around you, slow, deliberate, suspended in a world where time doesn't push, only drifts. The silence after the tea has its own shape, like a breath held between verses. But then, a soft rustle of robes, a quiet footstep on gravel. You shift gently now, not into fear, but into awareness, because not all duels were fought with blades. Some, as strange and graceful as it may seem, were fought with poems. You're stepping into one now. The haiku duel, a contest of presence, wit, and elegance. There are records of these poetic confrontations held between samurai of rival clans, or even within a single court. Sometimes they replaced violence, sometimes they preceded it, but always, they revealed something truer than any swing of steel, the mind behind the sword. You imagine a courtyard under twilight. Two men sit across from each other on low cushions, their swords laid flat beside them, untouched. A servant pours tea they do not drink. Between them lies a single scroll of parchment, blank but waiting. One clears his throat. He writes first. The sparrow flies low, as if it too fears the blade. But spring will not stop. A bold opening, elegant, slightly confrontational. The implication is clear. You may threaten me, but the world keeps turning. There's a smile tugging at the corner of his opponent's mouth. He responds, steel and cherry light. Even petals have sharp points. I need no reply. You can feel it, each line a strike, each image a parry, and yet no one bleeds. These haiku duels weren't about victory in the traditional sense. They were about presence, timing, precision. The same traits required in combat were honored here. Grace under pressure, clarity of expression, mastery of rhythm. Only here, the battlefield was internal, and the weapon, ephemeral. Sometimes these contests were playful, like fencing with feathers. Other times, they were deadly serious. There are stories of feuds between houses settled by poetry rather than bloodshed. Not because the samurai were pacifists, but because they believed words could cut just as deeply and heal more cleanly. One duel between two minor lords is said to have lasted 3 nights, with each man composing verse after verse by lantern light. They began in anger, but ended in laughter, having discovered, through metaphor and shared imagery, that they were more alike than opposed. Their final exchange, your river meets mine, neither knows where it began. Let us flow as one. And with that, the feud dissolved. No blade drawn, no lives lost, just two currents meeting and continuing. Historians still argue whether these haiku duels were formal rituals or spontaneous gestures. But regardless, they tell a truth that pulses gently beneath the surface. The samurai were taught to face their opponents with more than reflex, with thought, with patience, with the ability to see beauty even in confrontation. You picture now a young warrior, untested, newly elevated. He is challenged to his first poetic duel by a senior retainer, more a rite of passage than a threat. His hands tremble, not from fear of pain, but from fear of inelegance. The wrong image, the wrong rhythm, could mean disgrace. So he writes, a blade still unsheathed, yet even so, it reflects. I will wait my turn. A pause, the elder nods, a hint of approval in his eyes. The student has not won, but he has spoken well. That, in this moment, is enough. There's something comforting in this, isn't there? That one could face conflict without roaring. That defense might come in the form of cherry blossoms and river stones. That you could answer tension not with dominance, but with insight. Even now, in today's world, echoes of this idea survive. A cutting remark softened by humor, a sharp thought delivered through metaphor, a disagreement turned into dialogue through careful pacing and tone. These are modern haiku duels, even if we no longer call them so. You remember now that haiku itself is a form shaped by discipline, 5 syllables, then 7, then 5, not much room for elaboration. No hiding in vagueness. It demands clarity, precision, the very same virtues the samurai sought in battle. And so, they practice both, not to replace one with the other, but to understand that they were twin paths, sword and poem, strength and restraint. The samurai stood at the crossroads between motion and stillness, and through the haiku, they learned to move in stillness, to act within quiet. Another tale speaks of two generals poised to clash, each leading thousands. But before battle, they exchanged poems. The first wrote, "Smoke rises slowly. A crow calls from the hillside. Do you hear it too?" And the reply, "I hear the same crow, and wonder if it cries out for you, or for me." That morning, no troops advanced. Both armies stood still. By sunset, the battle had been postponed indefinitely. Whether this tale is history or parable hardly matters. It carries something truer than fact, the belief that awareness of beauty, of shared experience, could dissolve hostility, and perhaps, even now, we crave that kind of duel, not to win, but to be heard, to understand, to express the part of us that fears and hopes in equal measure. You rest a little deeper now, your thoughts curling like smoke above those imagined scrolls. Each line of poetry a breath, each duel a meditation. The samurai, so often misunderstood as only warriors, appear now as artists of the moment, shaping emotion like water, finding form in fleeting things. And you realize that the most powerful expression may not be the loudest or the longest. It may be 17 syllables, written in silence. So you let the words drift around you, and like a well-placed verse, you find your place within them. The wind outside barely stirs the bamboo leaves now, as if even nature pauses to listen. You feel yourself drawn further into this quiet world, where haiku once danced between rivals, where silence often said more than sound. But now, we drift into yet another expression of the samurai's inner world, one that didn't rely on syllables or rhyme. Instead, it unfolded in graceful arcs, flowing lines, and the subtle weight of each brushstroke, calligraphy. To a samurai. The pen did not simply write poetry, it sliced space, not with noise, but with intention. Each stroke became an extension of the body, a moment of truth made visible. The brush, like the sword, could not lie. You imagine a scroll unfurling before you, its surface open like a still pond. The samurai's hand hovers, then dips the brush into ink. With a single, steady motion, he brings a character into being, not hurried, not overworked, just one line, balanced in motion, full of breath. This practice, more than just artistic, was seen as spiritual, a form of discipline that echoed through the arm, the spine, the breath. If the hand trembled, the ink told the truth. If the mind wandered, the stroke lost its life. Calligraphy required presence, full and honest. In fact, some masters would know the state of their students not from their posture or swordplay, but from the way they brushed a single kanji. Were they holding tension in their wrist? Were they gripping too hard or too loosely? Were they thinking ahead to the next stroke instead of resting fully in this one? To write a single character, to truly write it, was an act of being fully here, now. One famous samurai, Hosokawa Tadaoki, was known not just for his military prowess, but for his striking calligraphy. His brushwork, bold and unflinching, was said to carry the same energy as his swordplay. And yet, the characters he most often wrote were not those of power or conquest, but of patience, of stillness, of snow falling on temple roofs. It wasn't about what was written, it was how, even the simplest word, moon, wind, heart, could reveal everything. A warrior's clarity, his calm, his courage, or his unrest. In many ways, the brush served as a mirror. It reflected not your face, but your inner rhythm. You picture a morning lesson. A boy barely old enough to lift a katana sits cross-legged before a long table, brow furrowed. His teacher, older than rain, says nothing, only gestures to the brush. The boy dips, lifts, and writes. The character wobbles. The teacher nods once, then speaks. Again, the boy tries again. This time, he breathes first. The line straightens. Not perfect, but present. That's what mattered most. And it wasn't only men who mastered this art. Samurai women, often tasked with managing the household, preserving the family legacy, were equally skilled. Many composed letters, poems, and scrolls of breathtaking grace. Their calligraphy became their voice in the world beyond the estate walls, a silent form of command and expression. Some samurai even used their calligraphy as their final signature. Before death, they would write a single phrase or character to capture their state of mind, not in sorrow, but in clarity. One warrior, before falling in battle, is said to have written the word mu, emptiness, not as in nothing, but as in everything at rest. No fear, no desire, just the moment, pure and complete. Historians still argue about the interpretation of such words. Was it surrender, enlightenment, irony? But perhaps that debate misses the point. The point was that the writing existed, that even at the end, the brush found the paper. That presence was possible, even when time was nearly gone. You begin to understand now how all these pieces connect. The poetry, the duels, the tea, the calligraphy. Each one a different form of the same pursuit. Balance, presence, beauty shaped by restraint. The samurai didn't write to escape war. They wrote to remain whole inside it. Even during moments of chaos, they found moments of stillness, and through brush or verse, recorded them like footprints in snow, fleeting, soft, but real. You imagine their rooms now, low ceilings, wooden beams, scrolls hung with care, a single vase holding one imperfect branch, the inkstone cleaned and dried. These were their sanctuaries, not separate from their warrior lives, but essential to it. A young retainer once said, "If I do not write, my sword grows heavier." It was not a complaint, it was a truth. To carry both required balance, to wield one required piece with the other. You wonder what your own writing would look like now, if you held a brush, dipped it in ink, and let the line form slowly. Would it shake? Would it flow? Would it reflect your mind, or quiet it? There's something calming in the thought that you don't have to force clarity. You just have to be still long enough for it to appear. That's what the samurai practiced, again and again, on the mat, in the study, in the tea room, on the battlefield. A way of life where the pen's quiet edge cut deeper than noise. So, you breathe, and imagine your hand hovering above the page, not rushing, not correcting, just writing. One word, fully, and in that word, everything. Let it stay with you as we move forward. The brush is set down, and for a moment, nothing moves. The ink dries in silence, the lines still whispering their purpose. But the air shifts now, gently, and you sense a transition not toward violence, but toward something else shaped by the same patient discipline. A place where battles are not fought, yet something is always being tested. You step into a garden, not a wild, blooming place, but one trimmed with intention, every stone positioned, every path curved with care, sand raked into quiet patterns that mirror the motion of wind or waves. This is not a decoration. This is a training ground, a spiritual weapon, a map of the mind. The Karasansui dry landscape garden was never meant to impress with color or fragrance. It was meant to still the body and sharpen the inner eye. It offered no distractions, only focus. And for the samurai, who lived in a world that required both force and thought, the garden became a kind of dojo for the soul. You imagine one now, a rectangular expanse of sand, raked into flowing ridges. 3 large stones stand like mountains in a sea of stillness. Moss curls around their bases like mist. A lone tree leans inward, not because of wind, but because of time. A samurai kneels here, not to admire, but to observe. The raking itself is a form of meditation. Each stroke of the wooden tool echoes the control of a sword swing or a brush line. But where those tools move through resistance, the rake moves through yielding dust, reminding the hand that softness, too, holds power. He moves slowly, not a single grain flies loose. The lines flow uninterrupted, a kind of whispered geometry. Nothing in the garden is random, and yet nothing is rigid either. This is not about perfection. It is about presence. And presence, as always, was part of the samurai's training. Some schools required time in the garden as part of daily discipline, not to groom it, but to understand it. The garden was a visual poem, one that demanded silence, humility, and attention to nuance. If your thoughts scattered, so would your path. If you rushed, the lines broke, and so they learned to move slowly, to breathe in rhythm with the rake, to see not just with their eyes, but with patience. Historians still argue whether the samurai themselves created these gardens or merely walked them. But even those who did not design them were shaped by their influence. Because within those raked lines and arranged stones lay a quiet challenge. Could you hold still long enough to see what was not obvious? You think now of how a duel begins, not with a strike, but with a moment, a glance, a breath, a reading of the space. And you see how the garden mirrored this exactly. Space, distance, alignment, intent, all without a single raised hand. It became a training space for what could not be practiced with blades. One samurai wrote in his journal, "The garden is a question that does not answer you. Only when you stop asking does it begin to speak." He did not mean it metaphorically. He meant it as a method, to watch a garden at dawn, to observe shadows shifting like thought, to rake without leaving a single intention behind. These were not aesthetic pleasures. They were disciplines, like sparring, like calligraphy, like poetry. You can picture a young warrior returning from battle, his armor dusty, his mind coiled tight with adrenaline and memory. He does not go to the bath first. He does not eat. He kneels by the garden. He picks up the rake. His teacher says nothing. He begins to move the sand. At first, his lines are jagged, too fast, too much force. But slowly, with each stroke, he softens. His breath deepens, his shoulders lower, and by the time the rake makes its final pass, his mind is quieter than it's been in days. This, too, is healing. This, too, is a weapon laid down. You feel that calm enter your own breathing now, as if something inside you has begun to align with those patterns. The curved lines, the open space, the deliberate balance between form and emptiness. That balance was essential to the samurai and to the garden, because the garden reminded them of impermanence. The sand would be raked again tomorrow. The moss would shift. The trees would lean differently with each season. Nothing stayed fixed. And yet, within that change, discipline held everything together. They learned to apply this to life and to death. One famous warrior was said to walk his garden each morning before putting on his armor, not for beauty, but to remember that even in preparation for chaos, one could still choose grace. He would touch the trunk of an old pine and whisper, "Still standing," then turn and begin his day. You wonder now how many words were never spoken in these gardens, how many silent conversations were held between stone and breath, between discipline and doubt. The samurai left behind few records of their garden thoughts. But perhaps that's the point. Some things are not meant to be recorded, only practiced, lived, felt, just like the stroke of a brush, the heat of a tea bowl, the stillness before a duel. Each one exists in a space too quiet for shouting, and in that quiet, something grows. Maybe not power, but perspective. A kind of strength that doesn't need to be proven, only preserved. So, you stay in the garden just a while longer. You watch the light shift on the stones. You feel the breath in your body fall into rhythm with something older than words. You let the patterns hold you, the way they held so many before you. No sword, no noise, just sand, just stillness, just you. Let that stillness carry us onward. The garden's patterns slowly fade behind your mind's eye, their quiet symmetry leaving behind a softness that lingers, like footprints on sand before the tide. The samurai has risen now, not abruptly, but gently, with the same care he gave to raking, to writing, to waiting. And with that movement comes a shift, not into action, but into thought. Because after the garden, after the tea, after the haiku and the brush, there was another place where the samurai turned their attention, the world of ideas. They did not only study weapons, they studied words, ancient ones, words written by philosophers whose names came from distant lands and even more distant centuries. Among them, Confucius, the Chinese sage, long past by the time samurai culture blossomed, found his way into the hearts and minds of Japan's warrior class. Not because he taught them how to fight, but because he taught them how to live and how to die well. You picture a candlelit room, scrolls stacked in careful rows along the wall. A samurai leans over a manuscript, tracing each character slowly with his fingertip before reading aloud. His voice is barely more than a whisper, yet each word holds shape. The scroll is not a battle manual, it is the analects. Confucius spoke of virtue, of loyalty, of harmony between roles, ruler and subject, parent and child, self and duty. And though he never held a sword, his teachings found deep roots in the warrior heart, because they offered a framework, one that didn't contradict the way of the sword, but deepened it. Bushido borrowed heavily from Confucian ideals, especially in its later, more codified forms. The concept of loyalty to one's lord, the importance of education, the reverence for hierarchy and self-discipline, all echoed from ancient Chinese ink. But the samurai didn't just memorize these ideas. They turned them over like stones in the hand, examining them, questioning them, living them. And when their swords rested beside their futons, and the night was still, many of them found themselves pondering the same timeless questions Confucius once asked. What makes a person good? What is the right way to act? How does one hold power without becoming lost in it? It's easy to imagine a young samurai reciting a passage before bed. The superior man is modest in speech, but exceeds in actions. He doesn't write it down. He simply lets it settle in his chest like warmth from a fading hearth. And yet, it wasn't all solemn philosophy. The samurai also studied nature, not through scientific texts, but through watching, through metaphor, through clouds. Yes, clouds. You're there now, on a veranda in late summer. A samurai reclines, not in laziness, but in contemplation. He watches the sky shift. One cloud, dark-edged and slow, slides into another like a drifting continent. He says nothing, But in his mind, the shapes become symbols, lessons. One cloud reminds him of ambition, expanding, expanding, until it blocks the sun. Another of regret, torn at the edges, trailing behind the wind. A wisp of vapor evaporates before it finishes forming, and he sees impermanence again. Clouds became part of their education. They weren't listed in curriculum scrolls, perhaps, but they taught what no ink could, that power is brief, that change is constant, that nothing, no victory, no title, no wound lasts forever. Many samurai recorded their cloud thoughts in poetry. I reached for the sword, but the cloud passed without sound, so I stood and watched. There's a gentle humor in that, a kind of self-awareness that peeled back the stoic mask and reveals someone very human. Someone trying, failing, trying again, not just to win battles, but to be wise. Historians still debate how deeply samurai embraced philosophy. Some argue that only the elite had time for such luxuries. Others point to surviving letters, diaries, and lesson books that show how widespread these teachings became, especially during the Edo period, when war quieted and the inner world grew louder. And regardless of rank, those who studied often paired reading with reflection. It wasn't enough to copy the teachings of sages. One had to live them, apply them, even argue with them. A well-known anecdote tells of a seasoned samurai who disagreed with a passage from Confucius. Rather than reject it, he wrote his own commentary, line by line, in the margins of his scroll, not as rebellion, but as conversation. At the end, he wrote, "This I do not understand, but I will keep it near, in case I someday do." That, perhaps, is the most samurai-like gesture of all, not to claim wisdom, but to remain open to it. You begin to feel how all of these pieces interlock. The discipline of swordplay, the restraint of tea, the patience of poetry, the clarity of calligraphy, the structure of Confucian thought, the mutability of clouds, each one held in balance, none more important than the other, all necessary to form a person both sharp and soft, fierce and thoughtful. And perhaps, in studying these things, the samurai were trying to answer a deeper question, one they never spoke aloud. How do I carry the weight of life without letting it harden me? Confucius helped, so did Basho, so did the sky. You rest now beneath that same sky, feeling how vast and slow it is, how it changes without asking permission, how it holds both storm and light, like you, like them. And as you breathe, as your thoughts stretch out like mist over a quiet hillside, you realize something simple and comforting. Even warriors look up. Even warriors wonder. Even warriors wait for meaning to drift in, like a cloud. Let's follow that drift a little farther. The clouds above have thinned now, dissolving like morning breath against a warming sky. In their place, a stillness settles, not empty, but full, a quiet so complete it almost hums. This is the moment between knowing and letting go. And it is here that the samurai often wrote their final words, not in commands, not in curses, but in poems. The jizei, or death poem, was not a requirement. No law demanded it. Yet, across generations, many samurai chose to leave behind one last verse, not for applause, but for clarity, a final glimpse of how they met their end, with eyes open, brush steady, mind unclouded. You picture it now, a room lit only by candlelight, a samurai, old and ill, kneels quietly in his formal robes. He has made peace with the moment. His family waits outside. His sword rests on the mat, polished, untouched. But in his hand, he holds a brush. The paper before him is plain, unmarked, expectant. He dips the brush in ink. The room is silent, save for the sound of soft breathing and the faint crackle of flame. He writes, "This morning's clear wind, even it will not return. I bow to its path." And then he places the brush down. There is no drama in the act, only intention. The poem is not an announcement. It is a release of fear, of ego, of everything that came before. This tradition may seem foreign now, perhaps even unfathomable. Writing a poem in the face of death? But to the samurai, it was a natural extension of everything they practiced: composure, clarity, beauty in the ephemeral. They believed that just as one could enter a room with grace, one could also leave this life with dignity. And the jise was that final bow, a way of stepping off the stage with quiet awareness. Not all of these poems were grand or abstract. Some were unexpectedly simple, even playful. One samurai, known for his humor, wrote, "I had nothing more to write, but the world kept still, so I filled the page." Another, facing execution for a failed rebellion, is said to have written, "No regrets remain, only the bitter thought that I won't taste spring rice." These moments capture something essential: the humanity beneath the armor, the man behind the title. When all else falls away, rank, reputation, scars, what's left is a single breath, shaped into words. And yet, the practice wasn't only for the old or the condemned. Young samurai, especially those preparing for battle, often carried pre-written poems folded into their sleeves or tucked into the linings of their armor, not morbidly, not fearfully, but as a quiet ritual of readiness, a reminder that they had thought about the end and were not afraid to face it. Historians still discuss the origin of this tradition. Some believe it began with Buddhist monks, who often wrote death verses as part of their meditative practice. Others trace it back to earlier warriors, who blended poetry and mortality into a single act of expression. Either way, by the height of the samurai era, the jisei had become a recognized form, not formalized, not judged, just understood. One poet-warrior wrote, "Cut from the same thread, sword and scroll fall side by side. The hands do not flinch." There is something almost comforting in this, the idea that words, too, can be companions in the final moment, that even as the body prepares to fall, the mind can still reach for beauty. And it was not always sadness that filled these lines. Some poems celebrated life. Some looked forward to reunion with ancestors. Some marveled at the ordinary details of the moment: the moonlight on a roof tile, the sound of wind in the trees, the way the tea cooled a little too quickly in the cup. You feel the weight of that stillness now, don't you? Not heavy, exactly, but deep, like the last ripple on a pond just before the surface stills. These verses were not meant to impress. They were meant to settle, to bring the heart into alignment with what already was. And they did. One samurai, struck by an arrow while trying to protect his lord, is said to have composed a poem as he lay on the battlefield. A comrade found it hours later, scrawled in blood on a torn scrap of clothing. It read, "The reeds did not bend, only I misread the wind. Let them stand in peace, no bitterness, no blame, just observation, reflection, an end drawn with the same brush as a beginning." Not all death poems were discovered. Many were likely lost to fire, rain, time, but those that remain offer a kind of whisper from the past, a soft voice saying, "I was here, I saw clearly, I left willingly." You wonder now what words you might choose, if given a quiet hour and a brush. It doesn't have to be perfect. The samurai knew that. What mattered was the effort, the presence, the choosing of words not to delay death, but to greet it like an old acquaintance. Perhaps, even now, your own thoughts have started to form lines, not grim ones, but peaceful. Something like, Stillness found me here, between the breath and the thought. I did not resist. And perhaps that's the gift of these old warriors, not their swords, but their softness, their ability to meet endings with grace, to face the unknown not by clenching tighter, but by letting go. So you rest now, quietly, in that tradition. No need to rush, no need to fear, only the quiet truth of this moment. And perhaps, one day, your own words will do the same, not to mark an ending, but to leave behind a little light. Let's continue walking that quiet path. The room, though unchanged, feels softer now. The silence that once carried the weight of a warrior's final words now carries something gentler, like dust settling on an empty armor stand, like ink dried on a page that no one rushes to turn. Time, as it always does, moved on, and the swords, they began to rust, not in disgrace, but in stillness. As the long wars ceased and peace took hold under the Tokugawa shogunate, the samurai found themselves without battles to fight. Generations who had trained their bodies to respond to threat now faced quieter mornings, longer afternoons, no urgent summons, no urgent cause. And so, they turned inward, again. But this time, it wasn't just preparation, it was transformation. The warrior became the scholar, the blade, symbolic, the ink, essential. You picture a samurai, his armor boxed and sealed, sitting in a sun-warmed study. Outside, children laugh, not as enemies, but as students. He no longer trains them for war. He teaches them language, literature, how to bow, how to write. He lifts his brush and begins a letter, not to a general, but to a friend in a nearby province. The letter opens with a poem, as was customary. Peace is a closed gate, but I leave it slightly ajar, in case wind returns. There's no melancholy in his voice, just acceptance. A quiet reverence for the changing shape of his role, because even as steel dulled, the soul remained sharp. These peacetime samurai, often referred to as shizoku or shai, continued to study the classics, to write verse, to perfect their calligraphy. They entered civil service, ran schools, presided over rituals, and through it all, they kept writing. Some even became professional poets, their verses published, recited, and shared in salons and tea houses. What once was private had become part of the public rhythm, an echo of a warrior's path turned inward. It's here you notice something. The poetry didn't weaken them. It preserved them. Just as swords were oiled and kept in perfect condition even in times of disuse, their minds were honed with each new verse, each essay, each teaching. There's a common belief that peace made the samurai obsolete, but that idea misses the depth of their evolution. For many, peace revealed the full scope of their character, not just what they could destroy, but what they could preserve, what they could understand, what they could teach. One samurai, in a letter to his son, wrote, "A sword that never cuts still carries its weight. Let your words do the same." You feel that weight now, not heavy, but grounded, like a stone worn smooth by time, still solid beneath your hand. Historians sometimes argue whether this cultural turn toward art and scholarship diluted the samurai's spirit. They ask whether a warrior who reads and writes is still a warrior at all. But perhaps the question is misplaced. Perhaps the more meaningful inquiry is, what do you become when the fight ends? The samurai answered with brush, with garden, with scroll. They didn't erase their past. They deepened it, and they taught others to do the same. You can imagine a young student, born decades after the last real battle, asking his old master, "Why do we still write poems about war we never saw?" The master smiles, dipping his brush into ink, to remember what it cost, and to be ready, should silence need defending. That's what the poetry carried, not just beauty, but memory, not just form, but foresight. And these writings became part of Japan's larger cultural inheritance. Some of the greatest haiku, essays, and scrolls from this era came not from monks or aristocrats, but from former warriors. Their words shaped generations. One of the most beloved figures of the Edo period, Matsuo Basho, traveled Japan on foot, writing verse as he walked. Though not a samurai in rank, his early life was steeped in the values of discipline, simplicity, and honor. His poetry carried the tone of one who understood impermanence not as theory, but as a companion. He wrote, "Even in Kyoto, hearing the cuckoo's call, I long for Kyoto." Such is the heart of the samurai's later life, fully present, yet full of longing, rooted, yet still walking. And so, while swords rusted quietly in lacquered boxes, the words kept moving, from father to son, from student to teacher, from past to page, and even now, some of those verses remain, etched into stone markers on forest paths, tucked into museums, yellowed by candle smoke, passed quietly across time by those who read not for instruction, but for something gentler, companionship, perhaps. A kind of hush that says, "You're not alone. Others have walked this quiet road too." You realize something then, lying here in your own stillness. It's not that the samurai stopped fighting. They just fought differently. They fought the erosion of memory, the decay of meaning, the temptation to grow dull in peacetime. And with their poems, they won. You feel that victory now, soft but unmistakable, not the kind with parades or medals, the kind that shows up when no one is watching, when a hand picks up a brush, when a lesson is passed down, when silence is honored instead of feared. That's what remains. So you breathe deeply and imagine your own hand. Years from now, writing something for no reason other than the shape of the thought, the pleasure of making it complete. And maybe you'll whisper, "My sword stayed asleep, but my pen did not forget. I lived in full light." And with that, the path forward gently unfolds again. Let's follow where it leads. The ink has long dried on their poems. The swords, polished but unused, lie quiet in shrines or museums, waiting for no one. The footsteps in gravel gardens have faded, and now, across desks and lecture halls and library aisles, another kind of duel begins, not with steel or brush, but with questions. Were the samurai truly warriors, or were they, in the end, something else entirely? The debate itself is quiet, scholarly, polite, and yet you can almost feel its tension. On one side, the image forged through time, the fierce, unflinching protector. On the other, the archive, thick with letters and poems and inked reflections. The record of a life lived less with blood and more with thought. Historians still circle these contradictions, like monks walking the same garden path again and again, each lap uncovering a slightly different truth. Some argue that the samurai were never quite what we imagine, that the romantic portrait, stoic swordsmen dueling under cherry trees, is a distortion crafted by centuries of art and cinema. They point out that for long stretches of history, many samurai served more as bureaucrats than battlefield leaders. They administered villages, they read and wrote. Some never lifted a sword in anger their entire lives. And yet, others counter, does this make them less of a warrior, or just a different kind? After all, what is a warrior? Is it the act of fighting, or the willingness to face conflict when it arises, with discipline, restraint, and courage? You picture two samurai now, one old, armor worn from years of war, the other young, his sword pristine, but his shelves lined with philosophy texts. One carries scars on his skin, the other questions in his mind. Both kneel before the same scroll. Both breathe in unison. Are they so different? You think of a retired warrior who opens a school for village children. He teaches them how to read, how to write haiku, how to serve tea with care. He still wakes at dawn, still sharpens his blade each week, not from fear, but from respect. He knows the sword may never leave its sheath again, but he keeps his posture straight, his bow low, his ink clean. Another man writes a journal, reflecting on the code of Bushido. He wonders aloud, in cursive strokes, whether a warrior who never fights has failed in his duty. Then, in the next line, he writes, "The mountain does not move, yet it casts a deeper shadow than falling stones." This blend of reflection and readiness, of peace and preparation, became the hallmark of the later samurai era. It confuses some scholars. Others find it profound. One historian suggests the term warrior philosopher as a better label. Another rejects all categories entirely, saying the samurai were simply human, disciplined, yes, but full of contradictions like anyone else. Still others trace the evolution more clinically. They argue that the Edo period's extended peace simply left the samurai with too much time, so they filled it with poetry, with philosophy, with refinement. They became symbols more than soldiers. Their value became cultural rather than tactical. But then again, symbols matter. Symbols shape nations, families, memory, and the samurai knew that. That's why they wrote. That's why they trained in silence, even when war was far away, not to prove their worth, but to preserve it. Because perhaps being a warrior isn't about how often you draw your sword, but about how you hold it when no one is looking, and more importantly, how you choose not to. There's a poem written by a samurai who lived his entire life without seeing battle. He was mocked quietly by other men, some younger, some bolder, but he never bristled. Instead, he wrote, "I raised no blade, but kept my garden free of weeds. Peace grew anyway." There's gentleness in that, but also strength, because choosing not to fight, especially when one is trained to do so, requires a kind of bravery that is often overlooked. You feel it now, don't you? This widening of what warrior could mean. Not just the fighter, but the listener, the teacher, the one who sees battle coming and still decides to plant a tree. The samurai, for all their contradictions, seem to understand this better than most. They wore two faces, one for battle, one for beauty, one for sword play, one for ink play, and they moved between them without shame, with grace. So, were they warriors? The answer, like so much in their lives, resists certainty. They fought, they taught, they wrote, they waited. Some shed blood, others shed ego, all practiced, and in doing so, they became something rare, not just men of war, but men of presence, of awareness, of poetry that lasts longer than any empire. You may never find a definitive answer in the textbooks, but here, in this soft space of reflection, a truth rises like morning fog over a still pond. They were warriors, but their sharpest weapon was not their blade, it was their balance. So, you rest in that balance now, not needing to resolve the question, only to carry it forward, to let it live beside your own inquiries. What do I protect? What do I choose to sharpen? Where do I let stillness speak? And, like the samurai, you don't need to answer just yet. You only need to sit with the question. With both hands open and eyes clear, let's keep walking, gently. The path ahead curves softly now, like a worn stone trail beneath autumn leaves. You follow it with quiet footsteps, as if each step belongs not to some outward journey, but to something deeper, something inward. Because for all the discipline in the samurai displayed in gardens, calligraphy, and verse, there was another battlefield they rarely spoke of, one with no visible enemy, no drawn sword, No obvious victory. It was the war they fought within. You feel it, don't you? That undercurrent of tension, the desire to be calm, and the difficulty of staying there, the pressure to remain composed while emotion tugs at your ribs. For the samurai, this was not just an occasional trial, it was a daily one. They called it many things: kokoro, the heart-mind; seishin, spirit; fudoshin, the immovable heart. These weren't metaphors. They were lived realities. To be a warrior, one had to master more than swordsmanship. One had to tame the self. You picture a samurai walking alone under the pale moonlight, his sandals brushing against pine needles. From a distance, he looks serene, balanced, but inside, he is wrestling with fear, perhaps, or pride, or sorrow, maybe all three. He has just been insulted in court. A lesser man, younger, louder, questioned his honor. He said nothing, not because he felt nothing, but because he was trained to let the storm pass through him, not move with it. Later, he writes, "My hand did not rise, but inside, 1,000 blades unsheathed, then returned." This is the war they fought constantly, the battle against reaction, against impulse, against the flinch of ego. They train their bodies endlessly, but they train their hearts more. It is easy to strike when anger rises. It is harder to watch the anger swell, bow to it silently, and let it go without a mark. In this quiet resistance, the samurai developed a strength that often went unseen, and it wasn't easy. Many failed. There are stories of warriors who, having dishonored themselves with a sharp word or an unguarded action, chose to atone not with punishment, but with poetry. They confessed their inner war through haiku, not as apology, but as acknowledgement. One man, after a heated argument with his lord, wrote, "I held the flame close, thinking I would not burn. Now I smell of ash." Another, who let jealousy cloud his trust, wrote, "He smiled and I frowned, but his joy was not my loss." The mirror cracked first. There's humility in these verses, and courage. It takes strength to admit you've been conquered, not by another, but by yourself. And so, each morning, the samurai began again. They practiced sitting in silence, not as rest, but as rehearsal. They memorized verses, not for show, but to soften the mind. They studied Zen not for enlightenment, but for calm. A famous teaching from that tradition reads, "When the mind is still, the sword is steady." You hear it now. The weight of that idea, that all external battles are shaped by the internal ones. That peace cannot be carried into the world unless it has first been practiced within. You think of the smallest of their rituals, the way they folded their robes, the care they took in arranging their writing tools, the way they poured water for tea. These weren't idle habits. They were acts of alignment, opportunities to measure the self against the present moment. If the ink spilled, it meant the hand was unsettled. If the tea oversteeped, it meant the mind had wandered. And so, each act became a reminder to return, to center, to begin again. Even their training halls were designed with simplicity in mind. No decorations, no distractions, just space to move and space to notice. There. A master might say nothing all day, only watching, observing not just the students' footwork, but their posture, their breath, the flicker in their eyes when frustration bloomed. If the student lashed out too quickly, the master would not scold. He would pause, then quietly place a brush and paper on the floor. The student knew what to do. Write the storm, let it take shape, see it, and then let it pass. You begin to understand now that being a samurai was not about never feeling. It was about feeling fully and still choosing calm, about noticing the war within and not feeding it. There's a kind of nobility in that, not grand, not obvious, but deep. A warrior who masters others is impressive, but a warrior who masters himself, that is rare. And so, they kept walking, through gardens, along mountain trails, into tea rooms and poetry gatherings. They kept writing, breathing, waiting, not waiting for peace to arrive, but for peace to settle, to become them. Some lived entire lives without ever swinging a blade, but they fought every day, fought impatience, fought bitterness, fought the rising tide of self-importance that so easily swells in silence. One poet wrote, "Late in life, no enemy came, yet each dawn I rose prepared. My name remained clean." You feel the truth of that now, don't you? The battles that go unseen can be the hardest to win. But the rewards, oh, the rewards, not medals, not monuments, but ease. The ability to sit still and know you've done your part. The freedom to respond instead of react. The quiet joy of seeing a thought arise and not following it. This is the war the samurai fought longest. And maybe, just maybe, they won. So you breathe again, slowly, deeply, as if you too are training your spirit in this quiet way. No armor, no weapon, just breath, just attention, just the choice not to rush. You are not far from them now. You walk their path in your own way, and that too is honor. Let's continue this journey, softly. The inner war fades now, like smoke slipping through pine branches, leaving behind a stillness that hums with resolution. The samurai has wrestled with himself, and in doing so, found a quiet strength. But even as his days continue with ritual and restraint, something else begins to stir, beyond his control, beyond his breath. A second life, born not from ink, but from performance. Because while the samurai walked their paths in silence and shadow, others watched, others remembered, others began to tell their stories. And so, the scroll gave way to the stage. It begins softly, first in the corners of tea houses and among court poets, then later in great halls filled with hushed anticipation. The figure of the samurai, once quiet and reflective, now appears under lantern light, dressed in silk, hair oiled and perfect, stepping forward in rhythm with flutes and drums. This is no theater, and later, kabuki, art forms that carry the spirit of the warrior not in battle, but in performance, where every movement is stylized, every word measured, and every silence deliberate. You sit in the imagined audience now. The room smells of lacquered wood and incense. A samurai character takes the stage, his posture noble, his words poetic. He speaks of loyalty, of betrayal, of the unbearable weight of honor. But this is not a real man. It is a version, a symbol, a distillation. The legends have begun, some based in truth, others shaped by centuries of reinterpretation. You begin to realize how, over time, the samurai became more than human. They became ideals, archetypes of courage, sadness, restraint, tragedy. And like all myths, their sharp edges were softened, their contradictions simplified, their silence turned into scripts. One story tells of a samurai who discovers his lord has been secretly dishonorable. Torn between loyalty and justice, he chooses to walk into exile, leaving his sword behind. The audience weeps, not because they know the man, but because they recognize the dilemma: to serve, to walk away, to speak, or remain silent. These performances, though embellished, carried the emotional truths the samurai themselves had once whispered into their verses. And through them, the samurai entered public memory, not as administrators or poets, but as tragic heroes. It wasn't only theater, either. Painters and printmakers added their brush to the myth. Woodblock prints showed warriors in glorious battle stances, swords gleaming, armor pristine. even when the actual wars had long since faded into the past. The samurai, once seated quietly in a garden, now stood atop imagined hills, victorious and unbending. Historians still argue whether this transformation was loss or legacy. Was something sacred diluted by its popularity? Or did performance keep the heart of the samurai alive, long after the world changed around them? Perhaps both are true, because myth has a rhythm of its own, a way of preserving and distorting all at once, a way of carrying emotion forward, even when details blur. You think now of an old samurai, still alive as his legend begins to grow. He hears a troupe perform a version of his own life, simplified, dramatized, made beautiful. He smiles, though not without a wince. Later, he writes, "They gave me more lines than I ever dared to speak. Still, I bowed with thanks." There's something bittersweet in that. The samurai, trained to fade humbly into history, now stood at the center of stories they could not control, stories in which they were sometimes too noble, sometimes too cruel, sometimes too perfect to be believed, but still, the core remained. In those performances, even when exaggerated, something essential lingered, the weight of duty, the cost of silence, the poetry beneath the blade. You feel it now, the shift from individual to icon, from breath to image. It's the way all figures of history evolve, especially those whose lives were steeped in mystery and self-restraint. The less they said aloud, the more the world imagined in their place. And the samurai, so private, so disciplined, became a canvas. In modern times, they would become film heroes, anime protagonists, symbols of cool-headed control and ultimate sacrifice. But you see now that all of it began not with spectacle, but with stillness. A man kneeling in the dark, a brush in his hand, a few quiet lines. That's where it started. And even as that image was retold and reshaped, it never fully disappeared. Somewhere beneath every dramatic retelling, beneath every sweeping soundtrack and dramatic pose, that quiet figure remains, unmoved, unworried, still writing. You sit with that realization now, that the samurai lived twice, once in silence, once in story, and maybe in both lives. They taught something vital. That honor is not always loud. That legacy is not something you build. It's something that builds itself. When the life you've lived is honest and clear, you let that truth settle like dust on a stage after the curtains fall. The play ends, the actors bow, and somewhere, off stage, the real samurai sits, grateful, bemused, at peace. Let's walk gently with him, toward the closing acts. The stage lights dim, and what remains is the echo, soft applause, a breath caught mid-thought, a shape in the mind that refuses to fade. You sit with it, not as a memory, but as a presence. The samurai, long gone in body, still lingers, not in armor, not in duels, but in something far more enduring, in the quiet code they left behind. Because while swords rusted and scrolls yellowed, the essence of their way, their patience, their precision, their restraint, did not vanish with time. It simply changed shape. You see it now in everyday gestures, subtle but sincere, in the slow bow of a shopkeeper, in the careful way tea is poured in a Tokyo alley, or how shoes are placed just so outside a home. These are not affectations. They are echoes, traces of a time when discipline was not about domination, but about respect, respect for the moment, for the other, for the self. One could say it's culture or habit, but to those who feel it, it's more. It's a rhythm inherited from lives lived deliberately, a kind of invisible architecture that still holds up parts of the world. And even outside Japan, the influence hums. In martial arts studios across oceans, in calligraphy classes taught to children, in bonsai trees trimmed with almost monastic care, in the way someone pauses before responding, choosing calm over reaction, clarity over volume. You begin to see how the samurai never really left, not in the way that vanishing implies. They became principles, passed not by blood, but by behavior, a modern craftsman, sanding wood with perfect rhythm, a conductor rehearsing a single measure over and over, not out of frustration, but out of reverence for precision, a student who closes their eyes before speaking, waiting for the words to align inside, all of them, in some small way, walking the path once worn by warriors. And yes, some of it is remembered intentionally, kept alive through ritual, reenactment, art, but much of it has simply folded into life, a way of standing, a way of noticing, a way of choosing what to not do, not say, not chase. This, perhaps, is the truest legacy, because the samurai didn't just leave stories, they left standards, not of perfection, but of presence. Even the principles they followed, like Bushido, continue to guide people today, though often unconsciously. Loyalty, integrity, discipline, honor, words we still speak. Even if we forget their roots trace back to calloused hands wrapping cloth around a hilt, or soft ones tying the silk threads of a scroll. A school teacher in a distant city tells her class to sit with focus, to speak with care. She has never worn armor, but her posture, her patience, her insistence on dignity over noise, these would not feel unfamiliar to a samurai. A nurse holds the hand of a dying patient, her words few but full. A father listens quietly as his child confesses something hard to say. A woman in a quiet apartment writes a poem before bed, not for anyone to read, but because the act makes her feel whole. None of them are warriors, and yet, maybe they are, because what defined the samurai was never just the blade, it was the balance, the unwavering choice to meet life with clarity, to train the heart with as much care as the hand. Historians might debate the details, how much was myth, how much was lived, but the feeling remains, and feelings often carry more truth than facts ever could. You think now of your own life, your own moments of pause, of restraint, of holding your words because silence was kinder, of folding the towel evenly because that was the right way, of redoing the thing no one would notice, simply because your spirit noticed. These are small choices, but then again, the samurai practiced small things too. They believed greatness was not something seized in a single moment, but something shaped across countless quiet ones. And so, their code, though it has changed its clothes, still walks beside us. In the order we place on chaos, in the kindness beneath control, in the space we make for beauty, even when no one is watching. A soft wind moves through the room now. Or perhaps it's only your breath deepening, your chest rising slowly beneath a blanket. Either way, something shifts, something in you bows slightly, not out of obligation, but in acknowledgement of them, of the path, of yourself. You don't need a sword to carry their spirit. You only need to live with care. And if someday someone pauses after watching you, if they ask, "Why did you move like that? Why did you speak so gently, wait so patiently?" You won't need to explain, you'll just smile. And maybe, if words come, you'll say, because stillness is stronger than noise, because grace is a form of strength, because some traditions never end. They just grow quieter. Let's stay with that thought, just a little longer. And now, the path draws to a close. Not abruptly, not with fanfare, but gently, like the last curl of steam rising from a teacup, or the fading hush of a wind chime in the evening air. You've walked this journey not with heavy armor, but with open breath and quiet thought. And so, we end where many of their stories did, beneath the cherry blossoms. You sit beneath the soft cascade of pink and white petals. each one fluttering down like a whisper from a season that knows it cannot stay. The air is cool, tender, not cold. A kind of stillness settles around you, not of silence, but of peace, of something earned by simply being. This is where the samurai often chose to reflect, to write, to let go, because the cherry blossom, sakura, was more than a flower to them. It was a mirror, a symbol of impermanence, of beauty that doesn't last, and therefore matters more. You reach out now, catching a petal on your palm. It lands without a sound, a single piece of something grand, something fleeting. The samurai watched these blossoms fall year after year and understood that life, too, was like this, brief, luminous, and better lived with grace than with grasping. And so they wrote. They sat beneath these trees and poured their truths into verse, never knowing who would read them. They didn't write for applause. They wrote to understand, to prepare, to bow quietly before the inevitable. One of them wrote, "A blossom falls down, not weeping nor resisting it, just returning home." You feel the truth of that now, that all things return to silence, to earth, to memory. And maybe that's not a loss. Maybe that's a kind of gentle victory. Because when you live with awareness of time, of self, of the delicate line between doing and being, you don't need forever. You only need to have truly noticed what was here. You think back now, slowly, to all the steps behind you, the ink-stained fingers, the quiet duels of verse, the still gardens, the rituals, the scrolls, the inner wars, the plays and the myths, the gestures still lingering in modern life. All of it felt so far away at first, but somehow, through breath and story, it became close, intimate, as if you weren't just learning about the samurai, but learning with them. You can almost feel their presence beside you, still and upright, not watching, but witnessing, not judging, but simply sharing the moment. There's no need to say goodbye, because they were never truly then. They are always now, in the posture of patience, in the silence between words, in the care taken with something small. They remind you that you too can live this way. You don't need ceremony. You don't need tradition. You only need to begin each day with attention. Attention to the way you rise, the way you speak, the way you respond when no one is looking. There is power in this kind of life, not loud, not flashy, but enduring. The kind that doesn't crumble when the wind comes. The kind that bends, bows, and stays rooted. So, take one last breath beneath the blossoms. Let it be slow. Let it be full. Let it carry you nowhere but here. And if sleep is near now, if your eyes are heavy and your limbs have softened, know that you're not drifting away. You're arriving. Arriving at the end of a story that doesn't need to conclude. A story that lives wherever care lives. Wherever stillness is chosen over noise. Wherever poetry is written not for others, but for yourself. And when you wake, whenever that may be, perhaps something small will stay with you. A line, a posture, a feeling, like the ghost of a blossom on your shoulder, or the hush of a warrior's breath, steady and sure, in the soft before dawn. This is where the story rests, not with swords, but with softness, not with triumph, but with trust. Trust that you too can walk the world gently. Trust that meaning comes not from glory, but from grace. Trust that falling, like the blossom, can be beautiful. So, sleep now, if sleep is ready, or lie quietly a little longer, letting the petals fall. Let them gather in your thoughts, not to be held, but to be felt. And if a single one stays with you, soft and unseen, then this story has done its work. Thank you for walking this path with me, and wherever your dreams take you next, may they be peaceful,